Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The new university academic year is now underway. Freshers' Week is becoming a distant memory, a hazy one, I should think, if students remember, remember it at all. But the cost of going to university in England is under scrutiny, and there's confusion about what is going to happen to tuition fees next. They're meant to be increased even further. But there have been some briefings within government suggesting this may not happen. Here's Emma Vardy.
It's Freshers' Week, and here at City University of London, thousands of students are arriving for what will hopefully be some of the best years of their life. But at what cost? Many students are now set to graduate with around £50,000 of debt, and fees are set to rise again next year to above £9,500. How do you feel about the debt you'll be left with?
I have to work hard for it to pay back.
Do you think it'll be worth it?
It depends on what job I get.
Do you have any idea at this stage how long it may take you?
No idea.
What do you owe afterwards?
No idea, but I know it's like around 6 or 9% of our pay gets cut off to go into to pay this back. That's all I know, but I don't know how long.
I'd say that the current system has a lot of strengths. It ensures that those who want to access higher education from all backgrounds can get to university. However, there are some areas where the system, I think, could be improved to make it fairer for students. Some students could do with further maintenance supports, and they've got more cash in their pocket. So I'd like to see some introduction of maintenance grants for those most in need. There has been a big debate about interest rates. My view is that for those on lower and medium incomes after they graduate, the government should consider how they could lower the interest rate.
There's concern in Conservative ranks about low support from young voters after Labour pledged to scrap tuition fees altogether. So it's rumoured ministers may be having a rethink, and there could be a cut to tuition fees announced in the autumn budget.
Well, clearly students are struggling financially. There is no doubt about that, and I think that's being acknowledged across the board. I think there are short-term things we need to do, and there are long-term things we need to do. The interest rate, to me, is far too high. It's higher than many other countries that have student loans, much higher than America, much higher than the Bank of England base rate, and I strongly think that the interest rate needs to be lowered. We do need to look at the level of tuition fees, but in the long term, actually, I think we really need to rethink what our universities are for. Universities must be about jobs, about getting students highly skilled, highly paid jobs that meet our skills need of our nation and give those students job security and prosperity.
I graduated last year from Sussex University, and basically I've been working. I did an internship for last year, but I didn't actually earn enough to start paying it back, and the interest just keeps on going and going and going. So it's like, will we ever be able to actually pay it back?
The Department for Education says students will only ever pay back what they can afford. But with concerns that student debt is spiralling out of control, it's thought the government could be considering the most significant climb down on fees since they were introduced in the 1990s.
Emma Vardy there. Well, we're joined now by the Conservative peer and former Universities Minister David Willetts, and from our Coventry studio, Hope Worsdale from the National Campaign Against Cuts and Fees. Welcome to both of you. Hope, first of all, Jeremy Corbyn yesterday renewed his commitment to abolishing tuition fees. It was in the Labour manifesto, but he didn't talk about wiping out existing student debt. Were you disappointed?
No, I wasn't disappointed. I was actually very encouraged to see Jeremy's renewed commitment to the scrapping of fees. I think it's a very, very positive step towards our vision for a higher education system which is free and accessible to all. Jeremy has never once promised that he is going to completely wipe out student debt. That would probably be quite irresponsible if he didn't have a proper plan to back it up. All he said previously is that he would look into ways of easing the burden on students when it comes to debt. But obviously in the long run, we would very much welcome and very much support taking steps towards wiping off that debt which is burdening so many students in really a very damaging way.
David Willetts, Labour introduced tuition fees, but they went up under the Conservative or coalition governments. Has it damaged the Conservative Party politically?
I think there's a big issue about fairness between the generations. I think younger people have it tough for getting started on the housing ladder, building up a pension. I think that's the backdrop to this. I think the specific thing we've done on fees has worked to the advantage of younger people because it means that they've got more resource behind them when they're in higher education, and we've been able to get more people into university because in the old days there was a cap on numbers and that's gone.
Right, Hope Worsdale, what do you say to that?
Well, I think that actually that's a very narrow-minded way of looking at it. Yes, OK, we've seen a sharp increase in number of students going to university. That does include working-class students. But no one seems to be, conveniently, no one seems to be looking about what's happening to working-class students when they're at university. Dropout rates from working-class students have been steadily on the increase. And it's also worth pointing out that 56% is the drop that there has been in applications of part-time students to university, which is undeniably a really significant route into higher education from working-class students, and I think that is too often overlooked by this government and those that support the fee regime.
Well, look, first of all, let me plead guilty on that. I think that the part-time students, we do have a problem. I thought by extending loans to part-time students we'd help more students go. It hasn't worked out like that, so I accept the point. However, I actually think the campaign, this slogan, cuts and fees, links two very different things. I don't want cuts. That's why we've got fees. If you look at the history, higher education was cut when it was financed out of public spending. This system of graduate repayment has enabled us to increase the funding behind each student. And my fear is that if we don't have fees, we will find we get cuts. And that's the dilemma. Cuts and fees are different things. We've had increases in university funding because they're no longer financed out of public spending.
Before I come to you, Martin, do you accept that, Hope Worsdale, that actually this was a change in a funding formula rather than central taxation, as you know, that it would be through the graduates themselves contributing to that system? Do you have a problem with that principle?
I do. I think that it's fundamentally flawed because ultimately we believe that higher education is a public good, it's a social good that benefits the whole of society, and therefore it should be funded as such through progressive taxation in the same way that healthcare should be, and education already is up to a certain level. And what I would say is that the quite frankly desperate proposal from this government of potentially scrapping fees to $7,500 is meaningless if they don't actually have a plan for replacing that gap in tuition fees with proper funding from the government to universities. What will lead to cuts is those fees going down and not replacing it with proper funding, and universities will be forced to sack staff and to shut down courses, and that is unacceptable.
And Martin, that is the crux of the matter, isn't it? Obviously, it's the way we fund our higher and further education. Does the system, as it is constituted today, tuition fees, work?
No, there are some substantial problems, but they're not the ones that are talked about. All the ones that are talked about tend not to be the problems. Look, let's get this out. Hope has a perfectly rational point of view that this education should be free to everybody and it should be paid through progressive taxation. David has a perfectly rational point of view that the people who benefit from their education should contribute more to it than the rest of society. That's a political debate. The political debate on this subject has been the most damaging political debate that we've had because it has fundamentally led to mainstream mass misunderstanding of how it works, and that's now skewing the argument. So let's be really plain. It doesn't matter if your tuition fees, the total loan is £20,000, £50,000 or £3 million. What you repay each year depends on what you earn. You repay, under the current system, you repay 9% of everything you earn above £21,000. So earn £31,000, £10,000 above, you repay £900 a year if you borrow £20,000, if you borrow £3 million. The only thing you're borrowing and the interest rate makes a difference to is whether you will clear what you borrowed within the 30 years or not. The current stats say only 23% of students are likely to clear it. So dropping tuition fees would only benefit, if we stick with the current system rather than scrap it entirely, would only benefit the highest earning, probably 20–30% of graduates. Cutting interest rates would only benefit the highest earning 20 or 30% of graduates. It wouldn't actually change a penny of what everybody else pays. The two things we need to change, David promised, and I've got letters from him when he was a minister, that the repayment threshold from this year would start to rise in line with average earnings. That was overturned. That is the biggest regressive cut that really hit students' pockets. And the other biggest problem we've got, Hope's talking about the debt burden. Actually, this isn't a debt. It should be renamed a graduate contribution. The amount of money students get to live off while they're at university is the biggest practical problem. Loans have to be bigger if we stick with the current system, not smaller.
Why don't you just raise or suggest raising that level at which students or graduates,
as you promised,
start paying back?
Well, the 21,000 repayment threshold is already a lot higher than it used to be. You could push it up. it would mean that even less was repaid.
No, that was a totally different system, David, when tuition fees were lower.
Martin,
when you started in 2012, I ran the independent finance. I've got letters from you promising it would go up with average earnings.
Where Martin and I agree is this is a graduate repayment scheme. It's not a scheme whereby students pay up front. It's graduate repayment. You could increase the threshold, but I have to say the 21,000 threshold, compared with where earnings are, is actually more generous than when we said it. Earnings have not grown as much as we thought, so £21,000...
But they have grown, and it's been frozen.
£21,000 compared with what we thought it would be worth when we said it is actually proved, if anything, more generous. But you certainly can adjust this. The fundamental
Where would you put it? Where would be acceptable to you?
I personally think that expecting students to pay back 9% of their earnings above £21,000 is not unreasonable. It means if you're on £25,000, you're paying £30 a month. I don't think that is unreasonable and is actually a fairer way of financing higher education than the generality of taxpayers, many earning far less than graduates, themselves having to pay. But you can adjust it, and it should be adjustable, and I perfectly understand this is a legitimate debate to have.
How high would you put it at, the sort of threshold when graduates have to start paying back their loan?
Well, I think, to be honest, the repayment thresholds, the Tories clearly showed where they stand on this when there were threats to obviously freeze the repayment thresholds, thus plunging people into an even worse financial situation. I don't have a magical formula for where I think the repayment threshold is, because ultimately we fundamentally do not believe that it should be in this kind of customer model where the burden of debt lies with the students that go to the university.
Right, but
David's talking about what's fair. Well, I think what is the fairest is that higher education is a public good. It should be funded through progressive taxation, and that means taxing not middle earners, that means taxing the super rich and corporations.
But if you look at the history, we've had that system, and in that system there were restrictions on the numbers of students, and the budget per student went down and down and down, and there were crowded seminars and ill-equipped labs. That's why we had to change the system. Successive governments changed to a better system because that old system didn't work for students.
And that's the point, isn't it, Hope? I mean, there hasn't been a massive drop-off of students going. You did make your point about working-class students dropping out and also part-time students being affected, but overall the figures have not come down, which does then point to it being a successful system. And if you're a graduate who's come from a poor background and you get a very highly paid job, why shouldn't you be the one then that pays slightly more back over a period of 20 years?
You know, I think this is an absolute lie that students have been told and that they see through, that higher fees has meant better quality of education in their universities. David talks about historically, when we didn't have tuition fees, there were crowded seminar rooms. I asked David to go onto campuses, go into universities and see what our lecture halls are like. There are students sitting on the floor who don't have room because universities are so driven by money. They are so driven to take in as many students as they can without actually properly accounting for the facilities. We have a cost of living crisis, we have a lack of affordable accommodation, and we have staff who are overburdened and therefore not able to deliver the quality of teaching that we're supposedly meant to have in these high quality institutions. It is a lie that fees equals better quality.
Hope Worsdale, I'm going to have to end it there, but thank you very much in Coventry, and David Willits, thank you for coming in.